So I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this beautiful land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I come from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation in Perth. And I pay my respects to First Nation elders past and present, and particular acknowledgement to any First Nations people in the room with us today. So my talk is about ageing futures, and Feti, you've given a really lovely introduction to some of the key critical issues that we're facing in this topic. And because I'm talking about ageing futures, I wanted to start by acknowledging that the life expectancy of Indigenous Australians remains around 10 years behind the rest of the population. My talk, though, is going to focus on migration and the ageing futures issues relevant to them in particular. So thank you to the conference organisers for the invitation. It's really early still in Perth, so I've got about 45 minutes. I'm going to shave a few minutes off that so we have a good 20 minutes for question time. My talk is divided into 3 parts. The first part is on ageing. Then I'm going to look at migration and diversity and end with care and who cares. And threading through each part is an argument about how and why ageing, migration and care are connected, as well as the social revolution, what I call the social revolution needed to address our ageing futures. Just a quick note before I begin on the SAGE Lab, the Social Ageing Futures Lab. So my home disciplines, as Feti said, are anthropology and sociology, but I lead a multidisciplinary research team at Edith Cowan, where our mission is really similar to the mission of ADI. We're trying to bring social sciences and arts-based methodologies to transform the social and cultural care needed to support ageing futures. And that in particular is to fill the gaps left by the medical and health sciences, which tend to dominate work on ageing. But there's a real role, I hope to argue, in this paper for the social sciences and arts-based methodologies. It's a tricky set of conversations when you're sitting around the table with medical and health professionals. We kind of have less of a voice in those contexts. And so that's some of the leaning in that I'm trying to do with our team at the SAGE Lab. Okay, so let's start with ageing. And I'd like to begin by asking you all, this is the audience participation part of the talk, guys. I'd like to begin by asking you all to choose one word or phrase that describes how you feel about ageing. How do you feel about ageing? And because I have more content than time, I'm going to ask you, if you feel comfortable, just to call out that word. Let's just hear some. How do you feel about ageing? Anyone? Sorry?
Old.
Old, you feel old. You feel you're already there. Anxious. Anxious?
Depressing.
Depressing.
Tired.
Tired?
Tired.
Tired of it.
Gracefulness.
Yeah.
Gracefulness.
Gracefulness. Gracefulness. He doesn't think about aging.
Serious.
Serious.
Experience.
Experience.
I think of aging and survival.
Survival. Hanging in there. Not just physical. Not just physical. Okay, so you can see a range of ideas here. And I've been starting my talks over the past couple of years with that question. And it's really interesting. Most of the words tend to be negative or apprehensive. Some are positive, graceful, survival. Some are ambivalent. But what is normally always the case is that the words people think of when I ask that question are all associated with the aging of older people. So we tend to think of aging as something that happens to older people. However, for some time now, the World Health Organization has promoted a life course approach to aging. For example, in 2016, they wrote a draft global strategy and plan for action titled Multi-Sectorial Action for a Life Course Approach to Healthy Aging. The report emphasized that aging happens at every age, not just for older people, right? So aging is a process that affects us, whatever our age, not just older people. And to get this message across, the WHO used the notion of functional ability. So I want you to look at the orange line. How many people are familiar with this graph? Okay, I know you're mostly social sciences then, because if I ask a room of medical and health sciences, this is their kind of daily bread and butter graph. So interesting, okay? This is the functional ability from the WHO. Hopefully, so I want you to look at the orange line. Our functional ability hopefully develops strongly in early life and peaks in early adulthood, but the graph shows that every age along the way is important to building that trajectory. So we have the best possible chance to maintain as much functional ability as possible so that we stay on that orange trajectory. This is good news because it means we can start working on the best older age we can have right now. We can start doing the things right now, whatever age we are, to invest in a better old age or the best old age we can have. So how can we maintain our functional capacity to invest in our aging futures? This is a really simple question. I know you know the answers, but more audience participation. So how do we maintain our functional capacity? Are the health messages getting through? What are they? Louder?
Drink water.
Drink water, yes. Exercise. Maintaining social connection, really important one. And the social sciences know about that one the most. I think that's the one we can contribute the most to. What else? Keep learning. If you don't use it, you lose it. That message is getting through. Healthy eating, nutrition. Anything else?
Sleep hygiene.
Sleep hygiene. I like it. Okay, so nutritious diet, regular exercise, healthy environment, access and quality services, access to and quality services, good medical care, social engagement, support networks, arts engagement, planning for retirement. So the key, planning for retirement doesn't always come up. So this is the idea about the aging future, you know, thinking now about the future. This is my idea about transforming our relationship to aging because we don't think about aging at every age. And I think that's a really important health message from the WHO that really speaks to the social sciences. So the key message I want to emphasize is the WHO point that what we do when we are younger will affect how well we age and what type of older age we will have. So, for example, the decisions that are made for us about diet and exercise when we are little, then the decisions we make about lifestyle when we are young adults and middle-aged, as well as the level of community support we get and the quality and appropriateness of the services we have access to at all levels of government, all contribute to what level of health and well-being we will have when we are in our older age. Now, this is not an easy sell. If you think about talking to teenagers or young adults about how their decisions now might affect their old age, it's not a very popular question. I've tried it. It's a very hard sell, in particular around sport and concussion, which is really relevant to Australian society. But this is part of what I mean about changing our relationship to aging, including starting much earlier to plan for retirement before we get set in our thinking and find it harder to change. So if you think about aging as something that is happening to you right now, at the age you are now, does this change the word you use to describe how you feel about aging? Maybe, maybe not. Do you have a different word now? If you have that aging at every age perspective? Yeah. More freedom? More freedom? Holidays? Maybe you're thinking more about what you can invest in or what you can... Mental freedom.
certain age, what job you want, where's life gonna go. That's changed.
Yes.
That's the same from that.
Yep. Yep. Anyone else? So the next question, what are the barriers to maintaining functional capacity? Very different answers when I ask medical and health scientists to social scientists. So what are your answers? What are the barriers to maintaining functional capacity? Cost, time, health, can't be bothered, agency, motivation. What do you think are some of the biggest barriers? Lack of supports, infrastructure, access. Okay, here's the list I prepared, Audia. Poverty, access, so cost, access to services, culturally appropriate services, social isolation and loneliness comes up again. Environmental degradation, we don't often think about that. Digital exclusion, we are living in a digital by default world. The portal for my aged care services is a digital one. Ageism. The big news items are our increased knowledge about the impact of social loneliness and isolation. Social isolation in older people has been shown to raise the risk of chronic health conditions, including dementia, by 50% and early mortality. You've probably heard the headlines. Loneliness increases the risk of premature death by approximately 26%, which is comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day and more dangerous than obesity, lack of physical activity, and air pollution. So what this aging shows, what this approach to aging shows, is that addressing these issues requires input from a range of disciplines, not just medicine and allied health, because medicine and allied health don't actually do the loneliness part very well at all. That's really where our disciplines can have a role. And including the creative humanities, and I'll return to this point in section 3. So can you guess which of these issues listed on the slide the WHO says is the biggest barrier to healthy aging? Poverty. I would have said poverty too. As social scientists, I think we tend to think of inequalities, as Betty was saying, but actually it's ageism, according to the WHO. Ageism refers to the way we think, feel, and act towards others based on age. Ageist views are particularly insidious because we are all guilty of them. Do you tend to make more negative as opposed to positive comments about your aging? Yes, pretty sure you probably do. So this word cloud represents the responses to an Australian Human Rights Commission poll asking how the media portrays older people. They're really nearly all negative. I think there's wise sitting in there somewhere. So why is ageism so dangerous? Just as the status, this is my take on why ageism is so dangerous. Just as the status of women in society is key to understanding intimate and partner and family violence, so too the status of older people in society impacts on how they are treated. And there was nothing more evident than the case study of COVID to show us that. Locking down residential aged care facilities was really cruel because older people, we keep them safe, but it doesn't really matter how they are. The Royal Commission shows this in spades. You know, when that first interim report came out, I'll never forget the media statement, which was, the state of aged care in this country diminishes us as a nation. The state of aged care in this country diminishes us as a nation. And this is partly ageism. Who got the vaccine that wasn't as safe? The older people. So very insidious. You know, who could be left last in the line? The older people through the COVID responses. The WHO reports that 1 in 6 older people have experienced abuse, mostly from family members. Elder abuse can be financial, emotional, physical, sexual, but you know, the biggest one is unintentional neglect. unintentional neglect, not checking in on neighbours who live alone, who can really struggle to get the nutritional input they need. Really basic stuff. So one of the Sage Lab projects is this report on elder abuse, commissioned by the WA Department of Communities, and actually really sobering kind of work. Another Sage Lab project was combating ageism in the bush. So we did a case study with the wheatbelt town of Pingelly. Pingelly is really interesting. They are leading innovation in ageing in the bush with a virtual village initiative, which is, I think, going to be a model for the rest of the country. It's getting a lot of traction. So ageism and abuse of older people is an increasingly important health issue. And ageism is definitely a social science topic. It's not a health and medical science topic. Because populations, it's a growing health critical issue because populations around the globe are aging. People are living longer and spending more time in increasing states of care dependency. So the stats are really clear. In September last year, the government released its 6th intergenerational report, a report designed to help inform and improve public policy settings to better position Australia for the next 40 years. It identified 5 major forces affecting us in the coming decades. Not surprisingly, the first one is population ageing. Over the past 50 years, life expectancy has increased by nearly 14 years for males and just over 11 years for females. The report predicts that in the next 40 years, the number of people over the age of 65 in Australia will more than double, while the number over 85 will triple. So the orange shaded parts of this slide, women over 85, men over 85, is growing as a proportion of the population. This is what we're facing in our ageing futures. We're in those numbers. So that brings me to the end of the first part, ageing. In terms of the social revolution needed to change our relationship to ageing, let me summarize my main points. To change our relationship to ageing, we need to recognize that we are likely to live longer and a growing proportion of our population will be older. And we're likely to have longer states of care dependency. That's what we're facing. How do we want to be cared for? That's the question. With more of our population being older, we need to address ageist thinking about others and ourselves. To help us do this, we need to take a life course approach to ageing, to understand it as a process that happens at every age, something that we're not, our dominant ontological narratives are not that one. The social revolution in our relationship to ageing allows us to think about the future of ageing, to invest in our ageing futures at every age. And of course, this is not just the responsibility of individuals, but of governments at all levels. And finally, we also need a range of disciplines, the arts and the social sciences, as well as medical and health sciences, to lead this agenda, particularly in relation to social ageing, which I argue in the next sections is about social and cultural care, the dimensions of ageing that are currently not well addressed by medical and health sciences. So this takes me to the second part of my talk on ageing, migration, and diversity. And pretty much any topic in Australia needs to address diversity. I haven't always thought of myself as a scholar of ageing. I'm mostly a migration scholar, and I've conducted over 30 years of primarily qualitative and ethnographic research on migrant communities and transnational families, as Fedi said in his introduction. So most of my work has been part of the research agenda that brought about the transnational turn that saw migration studies move from a focus on immigration and settlement to the transnational social fields that connect sending and receiving societies, conceptualizing social fields that stretch across time and space. I think the literatures in migration studies are still quite separate. There's the settlement migration literature, and then there's the transnational migration literature. And part of my work, especially on ageing, helps to show how we really need to bring those closer together. And that's some of the content that's coming in the talk. So families whose members live in different countries but who stay connected are transnational families, and they use technologies. And I imagine that most people in this room are members of transnational families. It's a really common, especially for people in Perth, the most isolated capital city in the world. So the community I've studied the longest is the Italian migrant community, of which I am an Australian-born second-generation member. The Italy-born are now an ageing migrant community. Almost 70% are over the age of 65, and the median age is 72. You were talking about the Greeks, similar pattern. So, like my father, pictured in this photo, who migrated to Australia at 19 years of age in 1956, and he's now 86 and living with cognitive decline. That means he's reverting to his first language, a language only some of his family can speak. So my migration studies has slowly, over the past 10 years, taken me into ageing studies. That's how I got here. And I quickly discovered that ageing and diversity is one of the biggest social changes facing Australia. And the Royal Commission into Aged Care did not do a very good job on CALD at all. So that is a missing chapter. Okay, about half the population, as you all know, were either born overseas or has one parent born overseas. These are the top 5 countries of birth from the last census, and they kind of match the oldest proportions of the community, although the Southern Europeans feature in when you're just looking at the oldest members of the population. Okay. What I want to do with this very busy slide, which I'm sure you all know very well, is just to kind of reflect on Australia's history of migration. Because what you can see in this slide, in particular, if you look at the middle column, the migration group, are the waves of migration that reveal the hierarchy of preference created through a series of strict migration policy levers that have been relatively enforceable due to Australia being an island continent with no shared borders. Australia is one of the few places in the world that can actually say we're going to have this many people enter the country, and that's how many people will enter. Very different to places like Italy with such an open set of borders close to neighbouring countries. So this story, as you know, began with the Immigration Restriction Act in 1901 on the eve of Federation, a very profoundly influential act, colloquially known as the White Australia Policy, which was not disbanded until the 1970s. Now, this early period was characterised by a social policy approach known as protectionism, with strict controls on movement, segregation of Indigenous people to missions, removal of Aboriginal people, removal of Aboriginal children. Preferred migrants in that early period were British, Irish, and Northern Europeans who were welcomed as settlers, while those considered non-white, like the Chinese and Pacific Islanders, were allowed in as temporary workers only. Social policy began to change from protectionism to assimilation with the massive post-war Southern European intake, which for the first time in Australian history saw the arrival of significant numbers of people who were then considered non-white. So Southern Europeans were considered non-white. It's hard to believe now we're very white. I have seen myself become whiter over the decades. But it required a major public campaign, the Population Shall Perish campaign, to change public attitude. People were concerned about these swarthy Southern Europeans arriving. The abolishment of the White Australia policy in 1972 resulted in some changes in the philosophy of settlement. So we went from assimilation, this one-way idea that you could shed your homeland cultures and become Australian, definitely not a transnational frame. Connection to homeland was considered a risk or a challenge to assimilation. It wasn't encouraged, nor was the retention of homeland language. It was seen to interfere with assimilation. Now we know that strengthening first language improves second language. The sociolinguists have proven this very clearly, but at the time we saw it as damaging. So we had this period where we shifted to integration, which was sort of a softer two-step assimilation process. And part of the reason we shifted, I think, was because the second generation were growing up bicultural, and assimilation was clearly not working. It's just not possible. You just can't do that. So we had, in the 1970s, Australia began accepting substantial numbers of migrants from Southeast Asia. 1975 was a turning point with humanitarian arrivals, and in particular, the Vietnamese story. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the Vietnamese boat people arrival. The 1980s saw the heyday of multiculturalism. When I look back, this is such an extremely progressive policy framework that included both cultural and structural forms of pluralism. In the health field, this included ethno-specific service delivery, heralding a slow opening up to various countries, including Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. So this all changed really in 1999 with the shift to a points-based system. And up until that point, we had family reunion dominating in the form of pathway that migrants settled in this country. In 1999, we shifted to the points-based and temporary systems. And there was a lot happening in the world that supported this. The dismantling of multiculturalism with 9/11, the politics of securitization, border control, onshore asylum, the threat of homegrown terrorism, Fortress Europe, and so on. So you can see some of this change in the changes in the name of the Immigration Department, moving from Multicultural and Indigenous Affairs to Immigration and Border Protection, and finally Home Affairs. And what I want to kind of feature in this story are a couple of things. One is this particular immigration history, this carefully controlled hierarchy of preference that we saw, has given rise to this particular demography of the aging population. So the green shaded area are our Southern Europeans, who are the older proportion of the community. As I said, 70% over 65 in that Southern European population. But as you can see, the blue shaded area, which are the many and diverse countries of Asia, are rapidly aging and fast following. So this is our future of aging, a very diverse. 1 in 3 people over the age of 65 was born in another country. We have one of the most diverse aging populations in the world. And another point I want to really focus on is this one. So in the year 2000, or 1999, as I said, was the first time in Australian migration history that skilled and points pathways were greater than family reunion. So that picture of Australia with 72% entry pathways being skilled and 28% family was, for the period before that, from 1901, flipped. It was mainly family reunion with a smaller proportion of skilled. And what this has shown, if you look at the permanent migrants by age group and visa stream, so the light blue is skilled pathway entry, dark blue is family, and orange is humanitarian. The only age group where family reunion is the most significant is the over 65. And this is really an important point because it impacts on the type of support that communities now have as they age. So those family reunion entrants benefited from being able to bring out their parents, being able to bring out their extended families. And as a consequence, they have really resource-rich communities now as they age. They still have a number of issues, which I'll come to, but they fare much better than those migration pathways which are temporary, which give rise to temporary people who often feel their lives are on hold, they can't bring out their family members, can result in much more and greater transnational family experience. And these communities in particular, those from humanitarian pathways, have a greater set of challenges as they age. And one of the features in the literature about this is the role of cultural brokers. So the second generation, the Australian-born, often play the role of cultural broker. They're bicultural. They can facilitate access to services. They can translate service provision and health messages. And so the communities that came through family reunion do that much better. The newer communities that don't have that expansive network actually need much more support to access services because they don't have the cultural brokers in the community. So these are some of the things that we're starting to recognise now that need further research. So if we consider the ageing trajectory and our diverse population needs, the current trends are in fact worrying. So I wrote a report with amazing demographer, Dr. Loretta Baldassar, trained by Graham Hugo. Such a loss, Graham's early departure. from the Office of Multicultural Interests. So we compared census data and found a cycle of what we call a cycle of vulnerability for older migrants, especially women who tend to have low education, no English, low employment, no income, and high levels of assistance sought for core activities. One of the biggest issues is that they present for services later and in poorer states of health because early intervention is critical. And this is why changing our narrative about ageing and thinking about ageing at every age is so important, because we could be investing in those future ageing issues like frailty, for example. One of our big SAGE projects is frailty. Frailty is the biggest determinant of older age well-being. Actually, if you're a dietitian, you'll say nutrition is. But pre-frailty in the middle-aged population is where we need to be doing the work to safeguard frailty. So this accessing services later and in poorer states of health, lack of appropriate services, because with the dismantling of multiculturalism, we moved to mainstreaming. Mainstreaming is the idea that one service can meet all the needs because now we're really clever at dealing with cold, but in actual fact, it often translates to monocultural service delivery again. So that argument about plural services needs to come back. So compounding intersections of vulnerability and pointing to a need for more targeted interventions tailored to specific groups. So ageing in general has challenges that we all face. Increased risk of isolation, which we know is critically damaging to well-being, decreased mobility, increased need for services, and digital divide. But migrants have an additional set of barriers: language barriers, cultural complexities, increased reliance on family members, and if you don't have family reunion pathways, there's not that many there to rely on, lack of familiarity with host healthcare systems, presenting to services later. At the same time, we do have resource-rich migrant communities, in particular those well-established ones, with those cultural brokers and community associations that really facilitate well-being in ageing. So my father, for example, despite his cognitive decline, still attends his bocce club, still wins tournaments, although he has no frontal lobe, so he's really mean to his competitors. But they put up with him because he's been at the club for so long. That is priceless support. And we need to be looking at how we can be facilitating that kind of resource-rich community for our newer migrant groups. The other thing that I wanted to mention was the types of older migrants. So we know the aging migrants, they're like my dad, they arrived when they were younger and grew old here. But we also have left behind elderly. Many of you will have parents overseas that you're caring for. They're part of our aging older migrant community. Follow the children migrants. You might be lucky enough to have your mum and dad be able to come over. I'll talk more about that in a minute. International retirement migrants we don't have. Cost of living here is very difficult, but some very wealthy people do retire here, of course. What we're seeing is an increase in Australians going to Southeast Asia to retire because it's cheaper to live there. Whole host of challenges there, new research needed. Older economic migrants, not so common in Australia, very common from the global south to the global north though. Older return migrants, we see some of that. So aging migrants going home to retire. Our work adds a few parent, grandparent visitors on temporary visas, big part of our ageing community, quite invisible. Migrants in residential care settings, I would argue that that's a kind of a special group of older migrants that we need to look carefully at. Migrants living at home who rely on distant care support, and Australians living at home who rely on distant care support because their children have migrated away, and left behind elderly. So I want to just spotlight with a case study on grandparent migration and flying grannies or visitor migration. This is Mrs. Hai, a participant in Dr. Hien Nguyen's postdoctoral research at the SAGE Lab. She came to Australia at the age of 61 to care for her twin granddaughters. Providing this unpaid or informal care allows her daughter and son-in-law to maintain their full-time jobs. She joked that she was a full-time babysitter and domestic worker, which brought her both contentment and exhaustion. Mrs. Hai's day often started at 6:30 a.m. and finished in the afternoon when her daughter returned from work. She slept with a twin and woke up at night twice to mix the formula and feed both. Mrs. Hay cannot speak English, she cannot drive, so she's completely dependent upon her daughter and her son-in-law to take her out. Her free time was between 8 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. when she could make video calls to her family members and friends in Vietnam or watch films or video clips on YouTube. She said she relied on her phone to stay connected to her former life and felt a sense of comfort from watching the Vietnamese content. We call these practices of digital kinning and digital homing to highlight the importance of digital inclusion in migrant lives. So most of her support was distant support, and she was providing support to her proximate family. Mrs. Hay would like to migrate permanently to Australia, but this is almost impossible. There are two streams: the contributory stream, which costs $50,000, which most people can't afford, and the non-contributory stream, which is affordable, but has a wait list of 30 years. Actually, Dr. Nguyen just updated me, 50 years. So administrative slowdown doesn't work. In the past, grandmothers like Mrs. Hay would have been welcomed under the family reunion stream, but this is no longer an option. Instead, there are temporary visitor visas provided by the government. Recent changes have extended those, which allows grandparents to stay for up to a year at a time. So what you find is that one set of grannies come over for a year, they go back, and the other set of grannies come over. This is the way people are managing their dual income families. This migration policy is designed to avoid the potential burden and cost of ageing migrants. However, it does not factor in the significant contributions these grandparent visitors make. In addition, the social reproduction costs to grow, educate, and develop the skilled workers like Mrs. Hay's daughter and son-in-law is borne by the sending country, and yet Australia is not prepared to support them to meet their care obligations to their parents as they age. And it's not just migrants with young children who need grandparent carers, all Australians do. Most Australians cannot afford a live-in nanny because of high labour costs. Childcare centres are also very expensive, places are limited. So most Australian families fill this care gap or care deficit with informal unpaid care provided mostly by women, especially grandmothers. So the care gap is a feature of most countries of the global north, where dual income families are the norm. In response, we've seen a dramatic feminisation of care worker migration, particularly to the Middle East, Europe, and even Canada. For these care worker migrants, the opportunity to migrate is tightly linked to this employment sector. The resultant global care economy has given rise to the so-called global care chains, where domestic care workers from the global south take up paid care in the global north and exchange dollars for care. The dollars go home so that people they've left to care for their kids and grannies can do that work, and they are caring for the kids and grannies in the global north. Domestic care workers are the biggest export earners for countries like the Philippines, for example. Unlike many other countries, Australia does not have a carer migration stream yet. This said, there's an increase in the use of temporary visa holders, working holiday visa holders, and international students to fill this gap. These temporary migrants are working in all parts of our economy, in some cases supporting the delivery of critical service like aged care. So many of these people wish to make Australia home, but too often face tangled and lengthy pathways to permanent residence. The recent review of Australia's migration system was scathing on this point, finding clear evidence of systemic exploitation and the risk of an emerging permanently temporary underclass. It states that temporary visa holders deserve clarity about their opportunities to remain, and that it's not in Australia's national interest to maintain a large proportion of temporary entrants with no pathway to citizenship, as it undermines our democratic resilience and social cohesion. And what we see is that aged care is a migration issue, and migration is an aged care issue. While we don't yet have carer migration streams in Australia, around 40% of our aged care workforce are migrants, temporary migrants, and that percentage increases as the skill level decreases. Therefore, aged care is a migration issue because an increasing amount of formal paid aged care labour, both in our private homes and in our public institutions, is supplied by migrants. This care labour often comprises the poorly paid, onerous and unattractive jobs that locals don't want. Some of these migrants end up in these jobs because they can't find anything better. Many are university educated in other fields, yet aged care is the only work they can find. Not surprisingly, migrant care workers have some of the lowest rates of job satisfaction and retention in the sector, yet there is very little research on them. Here we have a vulnerable aging population being cared for by a vulnerable carer population. Not a good recipe for good care of either group. So that brings me to the end of part 2. In summary, to change our relationship to aging, we need to recognise and address diverse aging futures. This includes, in particular, language and culture issues and access and equity. We also need fairer and kinder migration policy. If we need migrant labour to support our care industry, then we need to care about that migrant labour. And to do this, we need to take a life course approach to ageing and to think about the future of diverse ageing and the workforce needed to support it. Given these scenarios, increased population and these diverse ageing futures, it's not surprising that the second challenge identified by the intergenerational report is aged care, rising demand for care and support workers. And this is my final section, Fedi, but I think I am running over time. What do you reckon? 3 more minutes. Let's try that.
Good luck, Loretta.
Okay. So what I want to do in this section is just talk about the challenge of care. I'm sure you are familiar with the findings of the Royal Commission. The current system does not sufficiently recognise the importance of supporting older people's social and emotional well-being. It's a medical model. You get money for medical, physical, and personal care, allied healthcare. You don't get money for social care. And nurses and care staff routinely say they don't have time to care. Very simple issue that needs to be addressed with a social supports category, but challenging to implement. And this is where I think social sciences has a role to play, in particular because dementia is a big part of our ageing futures. It's currently the second leading cause of death in Australia and already the leading cause of death for women. Did you know that? Dementia is the leading cause of death for women. I was quite shocked to read that. Dementia is a social science issue. Dementia affects every part of life of the person living with the illness, as well as everyone in their support network and in their community. We need to be addressing social relational identities of dementia work. You know, there's beautiful work on dementia where to remain engaged in life, you need to have that social relational mutual care where your carers are finishing your sentences for you, are creating your narratives for you that keep you human, that make you whole. This is a really challenging illness to deal with, and it's in our futures. So we need social science to be addressing this. Good news is Lancet just added 2 modifiable risk factors to the existing 12 risk factors. There are 14. Pay attention, sit up and pay attention. 14 modifiable risk factors. Quality of education in early life. If that isn't an ageing across the life course point, what is? We need to be looking at quality of education in early life to address dementia, to reduce dementia risk. Air pollution, hearing loss, high blood pressure, obesity, smoking, uncorrected vision loss, that's one of the new ones, social isolation, traumatic brain injury, depression, diabetes, physical inactivity, excessive alcohol consumption, and high cholesterol. The researchers calculate that if, as a society and as individuals, we could completely address these 14 health and lifestyle factors, it could prevent or delay nearly half of dementia cases. This is the work of social science. Medical work is not doing this. They're focused on the medicine. 100 years of research, one breakthrough in the last year. Really expensive, horrendous side effects, only works if you get early detection. We're doing a really bad job of early detection. So what we're doing in the SAGE lab is doing social interventions, digital inclusion, music and arts engagement, and kind of picking up those really sobering comments from the World Health Organization about the role of social support networks and social connection in reducing chronic illness, including dementia. I wanted to end then with this map in my 3rd minute of Mrs. Howe's social support network. The pink quadrant is her local supports in Australia, and the purple quadrant is her virtual and distant supports. So what is missing entirely from the health and medical sciences literature is acknowledgement of the role of distant supports. If you have less than 3 nodes in your support network, you are at increased risk of poor health outcomes, including early death. These nodes can include pets. People routinely rank their pets as more important as their GPs. The most important thing about this is that negative supports are more deleterious than fewer social supports. So, of course, an abusive node is more deleterious than fewer positive supports. So get rid of your negative supports, try and reduce them, and increase your positive supports. And this is really important to aging academics because we retire and we've just got colleagues. We haven't put a lot of investment in our friends and family we don't really like anyway, but anyway, that's another story. So aging in place policy, which is the biggest policy framework globally and makes complete sense. These are the dimensions of aging in place, but it totally misses the transnational and distant carer. And in policy, that results in lack of digital inclusion, including facilitated digital access. We say, look, older people might not necessarily learn the digital citizenship, and we might have it as we age, but we might lose our capacity. So we need facilitated digital access. And here's a lovely photo of my dear friend, Natale, who ended his life in residential care, but poking out of his pocket is his phone and his tablets on his bedside table because he reverted to a dialect that no one spoke. And he was, his social connection was back home in Sicily through those digital means. And I think I'm going to end there. Thank you, Fedi.